phenomenology, which basically means I read phenomenology and existential phenomenology through East Asian texts, particularly Zen, as opposed to the inverse, which I suppose is more common for people to read East Asian texts through Western philosophy. But my training was inverted, so I read philosophy through the East Asian style, the more narrow canon. So to start, I guess I'm not Raphael Felber. He had to cancel, and my talk will not be on translating the Jiaolu. So if you are here for that, my apologies. Instead, I'm going to talk about translating no-thing. And it's going to be something of a meditation on, but also a discussion of the meditation of the Zen text. So thank you to Keishi and Pierre and Romain for inviting me. It's great to be here. In his paper, Desacralizing Philosophical Translation in Japan, Jim Heisig shares a rather curious bit of history with his readers, noting that the term translation, ironically enough, is a mistranslation. He informs us that in the 15th century, Leonardo Bruni misread a line in the Noctes Atticae of Aulus Gellius, where traducere meant introduce, lead into, as carrying over, and hence translating. The etymological mistake carried over to French and Italian in the 15th century and was then simply repeated in English. That's just a fun fact. Our contemporary understanding of translation is therefore one of carrying over. I find myself occasionally preoccupied by this fact when I'm working on translations, and this especially when I'm working with Zen texts. If we push the etymology further still, we find that the late of translate stems from latus in the form of oblatus, a variant past participle of offere, to offer or to bring before, from ob and latus, carried or borne, used as a past participle of the irregular verb fere, to bear. In this sense, I think we do well to reflect on the practice of translation as the carrying, in the sense of a bearing, as a bringing before as offer of meaning. And it's with this understanding of translation that I should like to reflect on Zen text. Given the ambiguous and conflicting nature of Zen's relationship to language, both written and oral, we would do well to consider the function the latter plays with regards to Zen practice and reflexively with Zen doctrine, and what implications arise in considering the possibility of translation. In other words, what does it mean to translate Zen texts? At the same time, however, we would also do well to consider how Zen texts translate Zen experience, how they translate no-thing, what other scholars will translate as nothingness, but I prefer no-thing. Or what does it mean that Zen texts translate? These two questions will guide the general arc of what is to follow. In order to work through them, I divide my presentation into three sections. First, I'll briefly discuss Zen as the doctrine beyond words and letters, as you likely all know, and the counterintuitive function played by language in Zen texts and Zen practices. Second, I will very briefly consider the implications of the Chinese and Japanese languages for early Zen texts. And lastly, I will examine Zen texts through the idea that no-thing speaks in the offering that is brought before, that is borne by language as a carrying over. So perhaps one of the most difficult problems for a reader or translator of Zen Buddhist texts is getting beyond the paradox of the use of language. Given that Zen is often referred to as the doctrine beyond words and letters, its position with regards to language has remained enigmatic, to say the least. What becomes interesting for the reader and for the translator alike is grappling with the fact that while the language remains empty, its message and meaning are plentiful. How then can one undertake the task of reading and translating the meaning of the meaningless, of giving sense to senselessness? I contend that Zen texts, as expressions of emptiness and no-thing, are best understood as adaptations of the practice of direct pointing as skillful means, not unlike what we heard earlier in this sense as upaya or fangbian or hoben in Japanese. Language in the myriad forms adopted by Zen masters is used as an appropriate form for conveying paradoxical and self-disruptive contexts of instruction. In the more extreme cases of its poetic form, Zen language facilitates the breakdown of the relation between names and forms and the oppositional structures generated through contextualized rhetorical situations. The Zen use of language is therefore best interpreted as a particularly Buddhist method of bringing about appropriate understanding. And so we might think on the problem of language in and for Zen texts. Roughly construed, this problem can be understood in terms of the paradoxical use of words and concepts as a means of showing the empty nature of all words and concepts. As expressions of conventional reality, to the extent that Zen texts consist of words, they are and remain illusory. At the same time, however, they do show no thing and the empty nature of conventional reality. Zen texts are therefore expressions of the inexpressibility of ultimate truth. One is perhaps here reminded of the Diamond Sutra, where Subhuti, in response to the Buddha, says, "World-honored one, as I understand the teaching of the Buddha has no doctrine to convey. The truth is ungraspable and inexpressible." Similarly, I think Zen has no doctrine to convey. Nonetheless, there is conveyance. Already with the first patriarch of Chinese Zen, Bodhidharma, we find a deliberate strike against the inherent worth of scriptures and, by extension, language. He tells us the ultimate truth is beyond words. Doctrines are words. They are not the way. The way is wordless. The Zen position that truth and the way are beyond words dates back to the original transmission to Mahakasyapa and becomes one of its central tenets. This general push away from scriptures and from language is furthered through the first 5 patriarchs of Zen and eventually finds its fullest expression through the illiterate 6th patriarch, Huineng. It is said that Huineng met a Buddhist nun who asked him to read from the Nirvana Sutra. When he confessed that he was unable to read, the nun scolded him and asked how it was that he expected to be able to understand the sutras if he could not read. His reply is meant to represent a pure expression of the Zen attitude with regards to language. The essence of the Buddha nature has nothing to do with deciphering characters. This, of course, leaves us in quite the predicament. How then can we make sense of Zen texts? One way we might do so is to approach them as showings rather than as sayings. In the line of Matsu, with figures such as Linji, or his Japanese name is Rinzai, and his teacher Huangbo, or Obaku in Japanese, we discover unique deployments of linguistic, be they gestural, oral, or written, practices for Zen instruction. According to David Lloyd, Zen masters such as Matsu, Huangbo, and Linji were apt to strike the student or shout in his ear. These actions were answers to the question, demonstrations of why, examples of non-dual action, each of which is complete in itself. Within a familiar conventional situation, students are pushed to realize the empty nature of all situations. Consider the following record of Huangbo. One day, Huangbo ascended the pulpit, and as soon as monks were gathered, the master took up his staff and drove them all out. Expectations of the convention here are disrupted. The students are forced to question and reevaluate the true nature of the situation. In this example, the expectation that a master will perform masterly conventions is not upheld by Huangbo. Instead, without words, the sermon is delivered through a disruptive act. This silence, however, remains a kind of speaking. As Huangbo himself reminds us, speaking is silence, silence is speaking. Speaking and silence are non-dualistic. This reinforcement of the non-dual and interdependent status of speaking and silence proves crucial when reading and translating Zen texts. Ultimately, Zen speaking remains silent, in the sense that what is conveyed remains conventional, and therefore illusory and empty. However, like the speaking of Huangbo, Zen texts use a form of paradox and disruption in order to point beyond themselves. The practice of direct pointing was then further developed by Rinzai, who placed a greater emphasis on the non-duality of action and speech, ultimately rendering instruction a context-driven means of dissolving contexts. With this in mind, if we return to language in the strict sense of names and forms, we find that Rinzai's roar is not always literal, that it is not always an action as opposed to speech. Regarding instruction and practice, he is famous for his use of language in novel and appropriate ways. According to Sui Li Chung, mature Zen Buddhists, especially those Linji masters after Matsu, are said to have had a non-metaphysical rather than metaphysical use of language. Zen uses language in a way that dispels any connection between contextual significations. Even the conventional discriminations in Zen teachings, where such metaphysics are presupposed and entertained, fail to maintain their reified contextual meanings in any real sense. Their use of language breaks free from the requisite metaphysical presuppositions that occasion such use. It disrupts and even outright abolishes the presuppositions inherent to linguistic claims and ascriptions. This is not surprising, given that Linji's practice is heavily focused on language, which, in both spoken and textual form, serve to disseminate throughout the East Asian Buddhist world a particular kind of religious rhetoric. The breakdown of the polarities of discourse, whether dealing with the sacred and the profane, the good and the bad, or any other type of dualism, ultimately occasions the Zen use of conventional language. Unconventionally, for the sake of undermining and showing the emptiness of any and all discourse. It is in light of this that I understand certain passages, for example, from the Linji Lu, the record of Linji, such as the following. Followers of the way, if you want insight into Dharma as it is, just don't be taken in by the deluded views of others. Whatever you encounter, either within or without, slay it at once. On meeting a Buddha, slay the Buddha. On meeting a patriarch, slay the patriarch. On meeting an arhat, slay the arhat. On meeting your parents, slay your parents. On meeting your kinsmen, slay your kinsmen. And you attain emancipation. By not cleaving to things, you freely pass through. While extreme in content, to the extent that they offend and disrupt conventional narratives and the contextual situatedness of the listener or reader or student, such passages are demonstrations of the practice of non-practice. They reject what is signified by practice. The rhetoric adopted makes use of its own paradoxical assertions in order to disrupt and dissolve traditional assertions that are similar in kind. The context fails to fulfill what is expected of it, ultimately refuting itself as the context it is presumed to be. According to Dale Wright, Zen, and specifically the school of Rinzai Zen, makes use of narratives recounting particular events in the Chan master's life in which the power and efficacy of his awakening are clearly manifest. These occasions are most often rhetorical occasions, discursive events that in one way or another display the character of the enlightened mind. However, the distinction between speech and action must also be abolished. Non-dualism dissolves all dichotomies. In this sense, the limits of discursive and rhetorical practices for the sake of soteriological instruction are broadened to the extent that they can include whatever content or context proves most suitable for any specific audience. Again, thinking through upaya. In light of all this, it's no surprise that figures such as Dogen readily concede that language is esoteric, here meaning the way of things as intimacy, according to one translator. He writes, "Intimate action does not know self versus other, as if I alone can know my intimate self and do not understand any other person's intimate self. Because intimacy is what is near you. Everything exists through intimacy. Each half exists through intimacy. Personally investigate," Dogen tells us, "this way of things with clarity and diligence in your practice." One way we might work towards understanding this kind of intimacy is in terms of correlativism or correlationalism, depending on who you work with, and intrinsic relatedness. I think that so that we might begin appreciating this kind of intimacy, it helps if I first share with you that I contend that the problem of language operates in concert with the problems of culture and metaphysics. It's no coincidence that almost all major source books and translation projects on significant historical texts necessarily include introductory remarks concerning the practice of translation and some of the general ideas behind translation practices. And so it would be irresponsible of us if we did not stop to reflect on why this is the case. As a first step, we can note that one of the central questions concerning philosophy as cultural practice is its relation to natural language. There are, of course, arguments in favor of understanding this question in light of the inevitability of expressing philosophy in linguistic form. Inevitability. These arguments, in turn, are often exposed as harboring bias towards some conception of language or another, ultimately forcing the debate back to the initial question. Rather quickly, we come to notice that the question actually concerns whether or not logic, broadly understood as the general laws that govern thought processes and argumentation, is itself universal or language dependent. Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont Jr., in their translation of the Analects of Confucius, argue that it is not possible to begin understanding texts written in a foreign tongue unless one first comes to rest upon a particular understanding of language and, by extension, of translation. Their unique understanding of classical Chinese, working from a generativist camp of sinologists, and the many ways in which they believe it differs from Indo-European language groupings, we notice actually comes to radically influence their understanding and, by extension, their translation of the Analects of Confucius. It is perhaps worth saying something brief at this point about the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic relations. Ames and Rosemont come to distinguish between extrinsic and intrinsic relations and relatedness. Casoulis, Moraldo, and Heisig prefer the nomenclature of internal and external relations. All agree that there is a concerted and obvious bias in schools of classical Chinese and Japanese philosophy to adhere to a worldview based in intrinsic relations. This means that no thing exists in isolation, from its own point of view, apart from those relations which constitute its becoming. We understand the world as primarily relational, and take the relata to be born only by relations. In the absence of such relations, any given phenomenon is nothing. Extrinsic relations represent just the opposite of this. A world of essential substances seem to relate and interact in different ways. In the absence of such relations and interactions, extrinsic relatedness says that any given phenomenon remains essentially as it is. At this juncture, it seems, and I do use seems quite deliberately for reasons that should become clear, that two questions arise concerning the role of the reader and or translator with respect to a given text. One, how much should be contributed by the reader, him or herself, in response to the original text? And two, to what degree can this be allowed while still remaining faithful to the text and the author's intentions? These questions become all the more pertinent when it comes to translation, and especially so when translating foreign texts from the distant past. If we are to adopt a position of intimacy and to appreciate the world as correlatively constituted and meaningful through intrinsic relations, then we could note that these questions take on a rather different meaning. One way we might work to understanding the unique bias of thinking in terms of intrinsic relations is by taking into consideration the fact that aspects operate in medias res, literally in the middle of things. The editors of Japanese Philosophy, a source book, note in their introduction that if Hegel recapitulated an entire Western tradition of bringing opposites into a final unity, Japanese philosophers were drawn to the logical place, the ontological or experiential ground of unity, out of which reality splits into discrete, mutually exclusive polarities. They go on to offer the example of the classical Western philosophical mind-body problem, noting that despite the Western bias towards understanding this problem as a matter of establishing connections between a mind and a body existing independently, we find that in Japanese philosophy this problem is understood as requiring one to ask how the concrete body-mind unity came to be thought of as a relation between independent, opposing substances. One of the consequences of this focus on doing philosophy in medias res is the force and strength of negative language, if only owing to the fact that the ground of meaning must itself be intrinsically meaningless. The ground of the world of being and becoming must be intrinsically empty, a nothing. To express the same thing positively, we can focus on the radical correlativism and absolute contingency that is weaved through classical Chinese and Japanese texts and languages and cultural artifacts. Classical Chinese is said to be eventful, here in line with thinkers again such as Ames and Rosemont. A world where experience consists of events, which are in turn experienced as persistently episodic. This move away from the interactionalist conception of the world aligns with the notion of philosophy in media res and comes to require the same negative linguistic turn to account for the radical contingency of our persistently episodic experience of events. As I've briefly discussed, this negative linguistic turn can equally involve a showing by means of paradox and contradiction, or reflexively, against even the most mundane passages found in the Zen canon, including those focused on everyday living and governance. This might be my most contentious claim in the paper. That's why I brush over it quickly. One particular way to appreciate this aspect of Zen text is to consider that if knowledge is an internal relation, then it is always somatic as well as intellective. It involves concrete praxis as well as abstract speculation. This epistemic position is further reinforced both in Chinese and in Japanese by the character for mind or for heart, shin in Chinese and kokoro in Japanese, which carries the meaning of affective sensitivity as well as rational thought, a meaning prior to the bifurcation of bodily and mental acts. Carried to its extreme, and in line with a number of Chinese and Japanese schools of Zen, in light of their emphasis on non-dualism, this position arrives at the conclusion that if one assumes human being in its entirety to be part of the world, then knowledge of the world, in the final analysis, means that part of the world knows itself. This is what is meant by, for example, a holographic approach, whereby one sees a whole inscribed in each of its parts, and here not only are the parts in the whole, but the whole is in each of its parts. This is possible only if the parts are related internally rather than externally, or intrinsically rather than extrinsically. In terms of the written language, there is again an idea of contextuality that works in determining the correlative emergence of meaning. What a character is meant to convey is often ensnared in its precise location amongst other characters, especially in classical texts. Characters which are themselves also only able to convey a meaning that is context dependent. One of the significant philosophical consequences of this approach is what Ames and Rosemont call the semantic overload of the literary Chinese language. And I contend, of course, therefore, in classical Japanese texts as well. And this semantic overload comes to be both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing insofar as it affords unique interpretations in light of unique contexts. But it sacrifices anything resembling what Whitehead, for example, calls the sacred fidelity to the original text. We're told that the lack of precision could be a decided communicative asset, a kind of productive vagueness that requires the reader to participate in establishing an interpretation and to internalize the given passage in the process of doing so. They contend that virtually every passage is ambiguous. And this is, Ames and Rosemont talk about the Analects specifically, but about classical Chinese texts in general. So virtually every passage is ambiguous, being subject to a multiplicity of readings until and unless a specific interpretation is given to it. Whitehead himself describes a similar phenomenon when translating, albeit without the positive productive vagueness embraced by Ames and Rosemont. He writes, "The multiplicity of meanings can be hidden in a term, in a phrase, or in the flow of the argument. Which is primary will depend on the context, but without attention to all three, the layers of meaning are likely to be lost more often than preserved. Depending on the text or fragment of text, the necessary meaning to be conveyed and disseminated finds itself hidden in some part of the language. The translator, in turn, through active participation in their role as reader and writer, as found in their contextualized relation, works to find and present precisely this meaning." I believe I've come to provide some answer, however provisional, and it is provisional, it might be, to the first question with which I began. What does it mean to translate Zen text? And I've come to provide some answer, however provisional it might be, to the question of what is meant here by Zen, at least for my purposes as I've described them. Unfortunately, both of these are problematized by the second question with which I began. What does it mean that Zen text translates? There is a way in which, I believe, Zen is a means for no thing to speak. It is, in some sense, a translation of no thing. It's here that we might contrast speaking and showing. Zen texts are a showing of the speaking of no thing. They are esoteric, soteriological texts, meant to bear the meaning of the meaningless, to offer a practice of non-practice for the sake of arriving at insight through the phenomenal realm immediately available. As Dogen says, "Now, although the views of an ordinary person, as well as the dependent origination that causes the views of this person, are what this person sees, it is not that the Dharma is held by the ordinary person. It is rather that the Dharma has, for a while, caused this ordinary person to be." Zen texts are therefore, in their own right, meditations. They are meditations on no thing, and work to articulate a showing of this experience. Again, from Dogen we learn, the verbal designation is the moment of transcending the established order. Referring is the moment of casting away the body. Not referring is the moment of simultaneous identification and separation. This is how to differ and agree. This is how to be, he says, uji, or as Rao translates it, the existential moment. The Zen practice of kato, of intertwining or knotting, being knotted, and of Dogen's insistence that the most effective practice is to cut kato with kato, can therefore be understood to operate at the heart of Zen texts as meditation. They involve a shared practice of intimacy, an intertwining in the counterintuitive, paradoxical, and self-contradictory phenomenon of the text. They bear the meaning of their showings of no thing, as practices of the emptiness of emptiness in their own right. I see them as practices of kuku, shunyata, shunyata. They are, in this sense, instances of the Genjo koan, the very presencing of the koan, coalescing into meaningful matrices appropriate to their context or occasion. They allow us to practice authenticate ourselves by letting the totality of phenomena advance. To translate Zen text is to carry, in the sense of a bearing, as a bringing before as offer, of meaning across. Most commonly, it is to carry this meaning across linguistic barriers. But it is also to carry this meaning across epistemic barriers, in the sense that when we translate, we do so by bringing such texts before the existent language and tradition into which we wish to translate, and must be sensitive to show what is lost and left unshown in our presentations of these texts. Zen texts themselves are translations. They carry, in the sense of a bearing, as a bringing before as offer, nothing. I think I'd better stop there.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Let's go, Lindsay.
Thanks for the talk. It's very interesting.
Thank you.
2 questions, and so let me start with one which is more topic. You mentioned Amy's and Rosemont.
Ames and Rosemont?
Yeah. We have a very particular view about classical Chinese and metaphysics and the language. At a point you mentioned that classical Chinese, like the written form, is semantic overloaded.
Yes.
Yeah, and somehow it requires the audience to participate actively with the text, right?
Yes.
So suppose our audience do not know much about classical Chinese,
Yes.
right? Then how do they productively and actively engage with the text, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it's strange, it's demanding to ask our audience who know very little about classical Chinese to actively engage with text, even like the analects, right? We see in the analects, even like the most so-called basic virtue like Ren has so many different translations, right? You see the Rosemont and the Emmett, they give a translation which is extraordinarily unique. Like
There's several different translations.
Yeah, several different.
Each more unique.
Yeah, and sometimes you see like benevolence and humanness and like all these things, and you throw these translations to an audience, English, like monolingual English speakers.
Yes.
How do they like actively, productively engage with the text?
This is a very good question. For one, I think that the semantic overload that they're trying to highlight in their work, and that I'm trying to borrow and reappropriate and repurpose here, isn't necessarily to be appreciated in the original language by someone who doesn't know the language. So when I teach undergrads or graduate students, I still don't often put up the original text because it's foreign to them. It's like an artwork. And they lose themselves in it rather than trying to pay attention. Instead, it's when undertaking translations, as most of us, I imagine, do here, there's a need on our part to be sensitive to these facts and to raise awareness in an introduction or how we present the material that says there are many translations of this. And there's a reason for that. And it rests in a particular way in which this language works and translation works. And it's this type of reflexive sensitivity that I think is more interesting for students. So I don't tell them, we're going to read Ames and Rosemont and they're writing the analects. I say, that's the one I'm going to talk about. But here's 5 more. Read them too. Because the only way you start to appreciate this kind of a metaphysics, if we want to use this language, is to see the semantic overload at play that's available to us in terms of different renderings in light of our own tradition, our own context, and how that works. I mean, when I work on, I translate 15th century Zen poetry, And even in the Japanese texts I work with, they're all translated from the classical into the more contemporary, and still there no one's agreeing. And so there is something kind of exciting about this understanding of language and how it might relate to, for example, the concept of nothing in Buddhism as this productive, not nihilistic space for this kind of emergence intrinsically. So I would never say they need to know the language. I'd be asking too much. I used to say that, but nobody listened. Not many agree. Come back in 5 years is not something you say to an undergrad. You have to say, welcome to the class, and yes, we'll talk about it. So, but you should be cautious, and we need to be sensitive. I mean, maybe this is a phenomenologist to me, but there's a need for this reflexive kind of insight into what we're doing, how we're doing it, and not having it as a major blind spot. Because I think that's when it starts to become dangerous. So